Hey, welcome in everybody to another Basketball by Association. I am Joel Cordes. Archie Shea has the day off, and I'm very excited to welcome in our guest here today. He is the author of a new book, Shake and Bake, The Life and Times of NBA Great Archie Clark, Bob Kuska, who wrote this along with Archie Clark. Bob, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
And as we get started on this, talking a little bit about the book, which debuted recently. It's available on Amazon now. You can get it in hardcover. You can get it in the Kindle e-version. Archie Clark is one of those names that I think a lot of younger generation folks haven't heard of, probably don't know unless they're really a diehard historian. And older generation folks will remember, but what drew you to this player? It's a really intriguing story, and I won't steal any of your thunder on it, but what drew you to Archie Clark when typically talking about like the NBA of the 60s and 70s, it's Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell and Oscar Robertson and Jerry West and those, Elgin Baylor, who we'll talk about in a few minutes too. It's those names that come first to mind, but this is what drew you to this story?
Well, I'm in my 60s. So that I grew up with all these guys. And so I've written a couple of books, and I wanted to do an NBA book. I thought about Earl Monroe first. I just thought it was really unfortunate. There are a lot of greats who really haven't been memorialized properly. I thought of Elgin Baylor as well. So what I did is, you think I'm going to write a book, and so first thing you want to do is get buy-in from the subject you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I contacted the Retired NBA Players Association, and I said, hey, look, I'd really like to do Earl Monroe, but I also threw out Archie Clark, and I threw out Archie Clark because he was my favorite player as a kid.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And the public relations person said, well, you know what? You're not going to get Earl Monroe. He's working on another project. He tends to focus on one thing at a time. But what about Archie? He said, Archie's a great guy. You should talk to him. So we set up a phone call and we talked. And, I remember, it's kind of a cool thing talking to your idol as a kid. And so we decided to do it. And I got to say, the book that we wanted to do was not a touchy-feely, what was it like off the court, and, on and on and on about his personal life, because he's not remembered in the same way as a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or a Wilt Chamberlain.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we wanted to do was a book about the business of basketball during this period, because this is the era that gives rise to free agency and really starts to grow the game and turn it into the modern billion-dollar juggernaut that we all know. And the thing about Archie, he was in contract disputes throughout his career. So
Mm-hmm.
He actually turned out to be the perfect person to tell this story.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here with Bob Kuska, the author of a new book called Shake and Bake, The Life and Times of NBA Great Archie Clark, which he co-wrote with Archie. And Archie Clark, an 11-year career in the NBA, with beginning with the Lakers, was an all-star with them as well, played with the 76ers, played in Baltimore and Capital for the Bullets, all-star season there as well, finished out with Seattle and then Detroit. But this is a guy who averaged over 20 points a game in multiple seasons, and like I mentioned, an all-star. As you dug into, I guess, the game side of things, and we'll talk about the business side in a moment, you alluded to that, because that really is kind of the prime mover of a lot of what's going on in this story about Archie. But Archie Clark in the late 60s, early 70s is one of those guys who is going up against some of the luminaries of that era, and more than holding his own too. What drew you to Archie? Why was he your favorite player as a kid growing up? And are there any of those kind of on-court stories that you really got to dig into?
Yeah, see, Archie has a very unique move. It's called Shake and Bake. That's how the book got its title. When Archie was a kid growing up outside of Detroit, he played some community football, touch football. So he always played receiver, and on the line to get open, he'd try to shake, do a series of stutter steps, and shake to get loose so he could get downfield and hopefully catch a long bomb.
Yeah.
So what he did is he adapted that to basketball. And he has this really, really memorable move, shake and bake, in which he would do the stutter steps and then cross over. He creates space. And I mean, I talked to Phil Chenier, the NBA great, who said, you knew it was coming, you could never stop it.
Now, you mentioned as well in the notes with the book, and as I did a little bit of research too, Archie Clark not only is kind of the godfather of this crossover move, but also gets credit as kind of one of the originators of the step back move in a way as well too, which today, you know, arguably with what James Harden is doing, that's kind of risen to prominence again. And Luka Doncic is another one over the last couple of years, maybe even more so than the crossover. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Archie's a pretty humble guy, and he probably wouldn't, it's just something that I did. And it was after his rookie season, he was working out with a guy named Woody Salisbury, who was about 6'7", 6'8", free agent at the time, former NBA Rookie of the Year a few seasons before. And Woody had really long arms. And so Archie, playing one-on-one with him, he had to figure out a way to get a shot off. And so he figured out, well, if I step back and then shoot. And so he started doing that. And as far as I know, according to Archie and other players, it's always hard to really pin things down, but nobody else was doing it. So he was pretty much the first or one of the first to do it.
And Archie Clark was a guy who was outspoken about his situation in the NBA. You mentioned the contract disputes. There's a lot of press clippings and such. He was always a guy that kind of wore his heart on his sleeve and his opinions on his sleeve. And that didn't always play well in an NBA era where you're long before the player empowerment movement. In fact, this is one of the originators of that. And you still have ownership really treating their players as property. And that's where not only in the NBA, but in other sports, that begins to be a big topic of conversation. And Archie Clark is right in the middle of that. Can you talk a little bit about kind of him as again, one of these prime movers in changing the game for the betterment of the players?
So Archie, if you read the book, I mean, it has a really interesting story about how he ended up going on to University of Minnesota. And then he was drafted. He played with Lou Hudson, the great Lou Hudson. And in those days, I'll get to answer your question in just a second. So in those days, schools really only could promote one player for All-American. That was Lou Hudson. Although Lou Hudson was hurt for most of his senior season, and Archie was the one-man band who really led the team, he wasn't promoted as the All-American, though he was all Big Ten, etc.
Sure.
So he dropped in the draft. And what's really interesting, and getting to answer your question, is trajectory is really, really important. If you come in as a high first-round draft choice, the chances are better that you're going to be profiled and really highlighted. And as we all know about the NBA, it's about fit. And Archie kind of came in as the last guard. The book talks about how he almost got cut because the balance code, the racial balance that the team still had. And he just got lucky that the player who was going to take his place broke his wrist in the final practice of the preseason. But Archie came in, he was hungry, and he realized, he was at the end of the bench. And he was a very keen observer of things. And he just observed how does the system work. And I just mentioned he trained with Woody Salisbury the following summer. And Woody Salisbury was somebody, at those times, black players took each other in as best they could and then said, this is the way the system works. These are the ropes. And so Woody Salisbury, as he did for many players, taught Archie the ropes, how to negotiate a contract, because Archie at that time players didn't have agents. The book starts with Archie getting rolled by the general manager of the Lakers. And so Archie said, never again. I'm not going to let that happen. And so in Archie's role, he became like Woody Salisbury, in which he was advising other players. He advised Kareem Abdul-Jabbar about his contract. And what's really fascinating for me, one of the highlights of the book, is after his second season. So Archie went from a kind of late third round draft choice. He started by the middle of his rookie season. He was an all-star in his second season, and he was really the key player in the deal that sent Will Chamberlain to the Lakers. But what's really fantastic about it is, you remember I just said that he got rolled by the general manager of the Lakers. Archie comes in and sits down with, out-negotiates Jack Kent Cooke to get this mega contract after his second season. It's just remarkable. I can't hear you.
There we go. Mute buttons are a dangerous thing. Yeah. Can you share any other fun stories along the way that you got to unearth, whether on that business side or on the basketball side of Archie Clark? Again, I do think it's so cool, the ability to not only meet your hero in this case, but to be able to collaborate with a hero of yours and to be able to tell a story that needs to be told. People need to understand where today's NBA comes from, right? And where player empowerment comes from. And I think really to honor those who paved the way for this in so many respects. That's an enormously important thing.
And the other thing I'll add too is it's very possible he could have been my favorite player as a kid and a real jerk. He's not. He's a very good guy. So that was a really fantastic thing. One of the things you mentioned at the start is that Archie's not remembered by a lot of people today, and so I was concerned about that. And the book is the life and times of NBA legend Archie Clark, and so what I plan to do is it's a narrative. The book is also written in the third person. It's not first person, and that's how we worked on the book. I was very intent. Did 100 interviews. Newspaper work, magazine work. I mean, really exhaustive research. And so, kind of jumping around a little bit here, but really, the book, what I wanted to do is use all those newspaper accounts as an ode, kind of to pay tribute to all the great sports writers of the past. And they're wonderful beat reporters with the 76ers, Lakers, Bullets. And so I pulled that all together as a way to really make it a vivid account of Archie's career in a way that 50 years later he's not going to quite remember. So I really like the fact that I got to pull together all of these details to show really it's a slice of life book. It's not a celebration of the myth or the romanticism of being a pro athlete. It's what it was really, really like back then, traveling on these road trips with all these horrendous snowstorms and so on. But to really kind of answer your question, I kind of focused on I used the life as the narrative, but the times part just exploded on me, absolutely exploded. I uncovered incredible amounts of information about the NBA, ABA years. I've talked to people who have now passed away who kind of gave me the ropes about how the leagues interacted in a way that's never really been written. And what happened, the reason I mentioned this is the book went on, it was roughly about, the manuscript that I ended up writing is about 1,200 pages. Nobody's going to publish a book that long. So what happened, so to kind of answer your question, all the cool things that I, about the times of Archie, that's to come. And I'll tell you about them later when I publish the next book. But what we did is we split it in half. So Archie's narrative really hung together really well. And the bad part is that it would have been nice to put more focus on the Oscar Robertson case and other things, the business. But that's just going to have to come in the next book.
Talking with Bob Kuska, the author of Shake and Bake, The Life and Times of NBA Great Archie Clark, which is available on Amazon right now. Be a great idea, not only for yourself, but for that basketball fan in your life. You can get the hardcover version or the Kindle version as well. And also take this time to shout out one of our sponsors here of Basketball by Association. That's right. You all know and love. It's Manscaped, the global leaders in male grooming from head to toe. And we mean from head to toe. The Manscaped Performance Package is the ultimate men's hygiene bundle and the #1 overall seed this season. Along with the award-winning Lawnmower 3.0 included in the package, you get the Weed Whacker ear and nose hair trimmer and the proprietary skin-safe technology, which helps reduce nicks, snags, and tugs, the stuff that you don't want. The stuff you do want, of course, is 20% off and free shipping, and you get that with the code BRAWL at manscaped.com. Thanks to our partnership with the Brawl Network and manscaped.com. Go to manscaped.com and enter BRAWL for 20% off plus free shipping. And Bob, when we were talking about getting involved with this interview and to talk about the book a little bit, it was just, I believe it was less than 24 hours after Elgin Baylor had passed away. And we looked at this as an opportunity to kind of talk about another player from that era. He's a little bit before Archie Clark, but there is overlap there. Another player who just does not get his due that he deserves. And you're talking about a guy who averaged northwards of 25 points per game through his entire career, essentially. And at one point is averaging 38 points a game in 1961-62. And I wanted to give you an opportunity, I guess, to, eulogize Elgin a little bit, but also the memories that you have of him and what you'd like people to remember and know about Elgin Baylor.
Well, the first book that I wrote is about the origins of black basketball in America. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. I'm still in the rough D.C. area, but I was in D.C. and I'll spare you the whole long story, but I talked to a source who said, I went to high school with Elgin Baylor, and I don't really follow the players today. There's a whole history of DC black basketball. And so I decided, I'm going to look into this. And the question that I kind of got into was, how did a city like Washington, D.C., if it kind of had early on started with black basketball, how did it sort of culminate with Elgin Baylor? How did the city create him? So Elgin Baylor was kind of a player who's near and dear to me for that first book. I never quite I told the whole early story, the actual origins of the game. That's another book you should read. But what I learned along the way is, everyone talks about Elgin Baylor as the guy who put float in the game, and he went up and hung in the air, and then everyone kind of came down, descended. We know that's not really true. I write about science for a living. Standard physics. He had a big frame. He was going to go up and he was going to come down just like everybody else. What I learned about Baylor, and to really understand his contribution to the game, Baylor had two older brothers who were much taller than he was. And he learned to play the game on the playground, playing against them, kind of going up against him. And what Baylor learned to do is he learned how to play off a contact. He would go into his brother. His brother was 6'10". So he had to learn how to do that. And so with Baylor, when he came along, what he became so adept at is that he played off to learn how to play off of contact. That's one of his great contributions to the game. Another fantastic story, which I've always wanted to put into print, which I never have, just haven't had the opportunity, is back in 1994, I interviewed his high school coach.
Okay.
He's now long passed away. I've got the interview on a cassette tape here. And just to give you an idea, Baylor went to high school at Spingarn High School in D.C. when it was still segregated. Things were still segregated. This is in the early 50s. Mm-hmm. And at the time, there was a basketball coach at Georgetown named Buddy Jeanette, who's a former NBA great. And Buddy Jeanette wanted to turn Georgetown into a big-time basketball program. And he decided the only way to do it was to go up and start recruiting out of New York. So he would take the train up and go up to New York and watch at the different rec centers and so on. And one weekend he was up there and he ran into a former player, a black player named Dolly King, who played at LIU. And Dolly said, "Well, what are you doing up here?" And he said, I'm here to get the best. I want to recruit the best player in the country. He said, well, the best player in the country, Dolly King said, is down in D.C.
Isn't even here, yeah.
And incredulously, Jeanette said, well, who's that? Elgin Baylor. So what he then did, Jeanette then went back home to D.C., called up his high school coach and said, hey, how would you like to scrimmage against my Georgetown freshman team? So they set up a scrimmage, and according to the coach, Jeanette's jaw dropped. Baylor was just jamming on him. And so yeah, Elgin Baylor deserves all kinds of credit coming through the segregated system. He went to college out west, played at Seattle, but again, trajectory is important. He then got in with Minnesota, with Minneapolis Lakers, as they kind of gave him the ball and let him go. And that was really, really important because up until that point, a few years prior to that, black players were supposed to rebound. I talked with Earl Lloyd, who's the first player to play in an NBA game. He wasn't there to score points. So Baylor kind of came in and took care of business and really helped along with Chamberlain. Maurice Stokes was actually the first black player to really get the ball and put up big numbers. His career obviously was cut very short because of illness. But that's the key thing. And the other part of Baylor's game, in addition to playing off a contact, he was very good at spin shots. And in the book, in Shake and Bake, Archie was a rookie and played with Baylor for 2 seasons. Yeah. And Archie was never an NBA fan. So he had heard of the name Baylor, but he didn't really recognize Baylor as a big star. And in fact, he thought, as Archie said, I thought he was lucky. He would just throw these things up and the ball would hit the rim and go around and eventually go in. And then one day after practice, he started playing against Baylor and he realized he wasn't lucky that he was skilled. He had, there's dozens of spin shots and combinations around. So very creative around the basket, and that's how he should be remembered.
We're talking with Bob Kuska, the author of Hot Potato: How Washington and New York Gave Birth to Black Basketball and Changed America's Game Forever, as well as his new book on Archie Clark, Shake and Bake: The Life and Times of NBA Great Archie Clark. And take this opportunity here to shout out another one of our sponsors here on BbA. So thankful to have them, and the Brawl Network, of course, that is DraftKings. You can get a $1,000 deposit bonus from DraftKings. All you got to do is create a new DraftKings Sportsbook account and make your first deposit, minimum $5. DraftKings will match 20% of your deposit amount up to $1,000 total for new customers only. And then you get to pick your favorite games or markets to bet on and follow the action. It does not have to just be basketball. It's practically any sporting event under the sun. And all you got to do is go over to DraftKings. When you do, please use the code dkng.co/brawl1k. So let's go to dkng.co/brawl1k. And Elgin Baylor works as a great segue into our final topic, Bob. Talking about, and this is what a mutual friend of ours, Ray LeBov, who's been on this show before. He's the proprietor, owner, founder of Basketball Intelligence. He likes to kind of derisively call these parlor games because you can't ever really get a good answer out of them. But I think there's something enduring about a question like I'm about to ask, because the game has changed so much over the 5-6 decades that the NBA has been around. It's gone through its specific eras, and what we see in the NBA today is so far different from the 60s and 70s and the 50s even before it. But the question always comes back to which players from that era might have done especially well in today's era. And of course, you can ask vice versa. And I love Elgin Baylor as an example there, because he's always stood out to me as a guy who he could play in any era. And of course, to make this fair, everybody's had the same training and same background and all that sort of thing. But Elgin Baylor, as a 6'5" guard, he was playing forward at that point, but so athletic, so crafty, so powerful. I think he would have done just fine and thrived and been an all-star in today's league. I wonder if you agree, or if there's any other names that pop out where you go, yeah, he would have been just fine in the 20s.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as mentioned, I did lots of interviews for the book, and I remember talking to Norm Drucker, who was a referee in the NBA, also ABA, and I remember him saying, "Yeah, Elgin Baylor, yeah, he would have been able to play in today's game." And I think a lot of people from that era would agree. Again, he played off of contact. He's very clever around the rim. He could go outside. He could go inside. Um, yeah. I mean, the game back then, the focus was on big men, and I grew up in Sacramento. That's partly how I know Ray, and
Yeah.
I grew up with Bill Cartwright, and so I would see how players coming up were big men really worked on their games and really skilled, decent footwork, and they had their go-to moves, and they could riff off of those moves and come up with counter moves. Um, so yeah, I think that any of those players, I mean, a Jabbar could definitely play. I mean, the challenge would be Jabbar led with his elbows.
Mhm.
Can't really do that so much anymore. Um, but he was so incredibly skilled. Will Chamberlain, he of course he could have played, and Bill Russell was, though not up to par offensively with today's game necessarily, smart. I mean, he just worked the angles on defense, and his legacy says it all.
I've
So
always thought that with Russell as well, that even if he wouldn't have been, offensively impactful in today's game, and again, players could learn the 3-point shot now the same way, or back then the way that they did now had it existed. But there's still plenty of NBA players out there, very good ones, who run the floor, block shots, rebound, anchor a defense, and then that even when you don't run a play for them offensively, they're going to get involved every single time as a screen setter, as a roller, as a
mhm.
short corner type of guy, and Russell would have been just fine in those situations. Wilt is a guy that I look at and go, he probably would have put it on himself to lead the league in 3-point percentage, just in one season, just to prove he could, right?
Right.
He would have spent an entire offseason booting up for that and then done it
Yeah.
and moved on to that next personal challenge.
I'll tell you something. I asked Archie about playing the different centers, and I remember him saying that he said, don't get me wrong here. Wilt was a great player. Bill Russell was a great player, but they had little holes in their games that you could exploit. He said the player, the most complete player, the toughest center that I ever faced, you knew when you played him, you were in for a long, long night. And that was Nate Thurmond.
That in some ways doesn't surprise me. He was one of two that I was thinking. I was thinking maybe Artis Gilmore in there too, but yeah, Thurmond was the other name, just because I've heard that before too. Some of the other luminaries talking about Thurman's just ability to beat him up when they would
But
play.
he did everything well. And I just picked
Yeah.
up an old magazine with an article, with an interview with Wes Unseld, and he said the same thing. Thurmond is the guy that I have a hand. It's just tough to deal with.
The flip side of the question before we let you go, and we're talking with Bob Kuska, the author of Shake and Bake, The Life and Times of NBA Great Archie Clark, which is available on Amazon right now. The flip side of that question, of course, is as you look at today's game and how much it has changed, some of the older generation players will derisively go, oh yeah, this guy wouldn't survive. And in our game back then, because it was so much more physical, you didn't have so many rules kind of protecting the driver. And of course, you didn't have the 3-point line stretching the floor out. But at the same time, there are plenty of players in today's game where you go, all right, given the same circumstances, same training regimen, that sort of thing, yeah, I think he would have been fine too. Is there anybody that comes to mind in that regard where you go, deep down, this guy really is a 60s and 70s player maybe at heart?
Yeah, this is kind of a cop-out answer. I mean, players today are so talented. I mean, they really are. They truly are. Sometimes I think about Steph Curry, for example. It would have been rough for him. I mean, it was a very physical game, but look at his career. Look how clever. Look how he's improved every single season. He would have, the way he plays the angles, just his shooting ability, his ability to see the court. I mean, remember him at Davidson. It was clear that he was a special talent. Would he have held up physically I don't know. Would he have figured it out? Smart enough to do it. What might be lacking, the players that you would tend to kind of go for to answer this is like a DeRozan, the players who have mid-range games.
Mm-hmm.
He's somebody that kind of stands out for me. Somebody who I think is kind of underappreciated throughout his career. It's just really always put up big numbers and is really at his peak was an incredibly talented player.
I've always been intrigued by the idea of James Harden in that era. He certainly isn't going to get to the free throw line as many times as he does today, but that bowling ball ability to get into the lane and also very, very crafty at dribbling to be able to run the offense, and then that shooting ability, which stretches so far today, but would have been mid-range at that time. I look at him kind of in that same Elgin Baylor mode, even in kind of the Oscar Robertson mode offensively too, where big, strong, really just understands how to get the angles and leverage that he wants, and he would have been a good example there too.
Yeah, Earl Monroe was another guy. You don't think of him as being a physical guy, but he really was.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. But yeah, it's a cop-out answer. But the players today are so well, they're prepped. They can play. I just remember a great quote from Walt Frazier, the great Walt Frazier, saying, how can these players be so good and be so stupid? And that is, what they do well, they do really, really well. What they don't do at all. And maybe that's kind of an answer. Is those who could adapt their games a little bit more.
I think that's a great point to end on. And I think the nuances of the game have changed so much. We always talk about the 3-point shot is the prime mover, and that's true, and the rule changes and all that stuff. But really what it's done is it's shifted what nuance is in the NBA. Nuances from 60s and 70s are one thing, to be able to get your shot up, to be able to defend somebody, to lock somebody down. And today that nuance has moved way far over. And that doesn't mean a player is less skilled or less smart. There's just a different facet of the game that you have to master. And like you said, in doing that mastery, you've left a different type of nuance completely in the dust because it may not be what you need anymore.
Yeah, it'd be great to have, if you ever did a show on sort of, there's a lot of discussion now about kind of balancing it, more of an inside game. But I gotta say, one thing that I really liked about the recent NCAA tournament is you saw a lot more inside play, a lot more, and so that was kind of a hopeful thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's cornering market efficiency, right? At one point when 3-point shooting and speeding up the game was cornering something slow moving and you got a huge advantage, that's a huge thing. And now that you've gone in one extreme, there are teams out there still searching and looking for ways and finding ways to corner the new market efficiency, which is I can beat somebody up inside as long as my guys are skilled enough to not get beat out on pick and roll, defensively.
Right, and it's always great to play inside out anyway. If you have guys spot up in the corners and so on, that's always a great way to play basketball. But just a balance would be nice, because I remember growing up with a Jabbar, and you just wonder what would Jabbar do in today's game, because you don't have players who really. Again, this gets back to what I was saying before. What players do well, they do really, really well, but players aren't as skilled at feeding the post like they once were. Would he see the ball, or would these guys be jacking up 3-point shots with 18 seconds left on the shot clock? That's what really is disheartening.
I see Jabbar, and I see the closest comparison. It's not a perfect one, but to Joel Embiid today, as a guy that the ball does find him inside, he does dominate, but he's worked really hard to diversify the game enough to have some range that he creates that reverse gravity away from the paint to get his guards open too. And I think that's kind of the archetype that somebody like Jabbar, or even a little bit later, a Hakeem Olajuwon and somebody, they would have been just fine. They would have fit kind of into that mold. And it's still a unicorn. And that's the thing, as many great centers as there were roaming the paint in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, they still were unicorns, right? They still were once in a generation type of players. You had really skilled other centers, but the luminary guys, I think that translates across, forever.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to think like a Bob Lanier, he's got to pound the ball a little bit to get in position for his winding hook. Would he be able to do that because he get doubled immediately? So it's just different. It's just different.
Been joined here by Bob Kuska, the author of Shake and Bake, The Life and Times of Archie Clark, NBA great Archie Clark. Bob, it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you today about not only that book, but also Hot Potato and Elgin Baylor. And of course, just looking across the eras, I really appreciate you joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. It's been my pleasure.
And thanks to everybody who gave us a listen today. Of course, if you're hearing us on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts and you want the video version, please check us out on YouTube. All you got to do is search Basketball by Association or BbA. We will pop right up. Give us a like, give us a share, all that good stuff as we get the new YouTube channel off the ground. And if you're watching us on YouTube and want the audio-only version, of course, you can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. And we are always for free. We'll be back again with our Sunday full show. Archie Shea will be back in the studio at that time as we launch into BbA 56, episode 56 at that time. So thanks again, Bob. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you on the flip side.